Thank you all for coming out tonight on this cold night. Welcome to our fourth and final Pen to Podium lecture of 2019, sponsored by the Arkansas State Archives. My name is Julianne Crawford, and I'm our acting director at the Arkansas State Archives. I'm also our curator. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, we would like to thank a few people. First, we want to thank the Division of Arkansas Heritage for allowing us to use this space tonight, and to Two Sisters Catering for providing tonight's refreshments. We would also like to thank the Friends of the Arkansas State Archives for sponsoring our Pen to Podium lectures. We're grateful for their support and for the work that they do on our behalf. If you aren't a member and haven't had a chance to learn more about the organization, there's a table in the lobby with information about them. Tonight's speaker is Joe David Rice, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years now, as he was the director of tourism for over 30 years. Born in Paragould and raised in Jonesboro, he graduated from the University of Fayetteville and the University of Illinois, where he earned a master's degree in environmental planning. He came to the tourism department in the 1980s. He became the tourism director for the Arkansas Department of Parks and Tourism in 1987, a position he held for 30 years until his retirement in 2017. In addition to promoting tourism in the natural state, he also helped to establish a tourism development trust fund, assist with the passage of Amendment 75, also known as the 8th of a cent conservation tax, and helped to get the Arkansas Wilderness Act of 1983 passed by the U.S. Congress. He has received national acclaim from the National Recreation and Parks Association and the National Park Service, and served 2 terms as chair of the National Council for State Tourism Directors. He has also been published in American Photography magazine and produced the Arkansas Floaters Kit. During his time as tourism director, his interest in obscure history of Arkansas grew. He would come down to the Arkansas State Archives, then known as the Arkansas History Commission, to delve into the records as he told of his plans to write an Arkansas A to Z book. I helped find information on Watson State Park, which was a park for African Americans in Arkansas. That didn't last very long, and we tried to locate exactly where it was and tried to help him with some possible Z-related items. After his retirement, he completed and published the 2-volume set of Arkansas Backstories, Quirks, Characters, and Curiosities of the Natural State, which he will be speaking about tonight. Please help me in welcoming Joe David Rice.
Julian, if I could have those remarks at the end of the day, I probably need those for my obituary. I think that would be very helpful. It's neat to look out here. I think I know about half y'all, and it's fun to see such a good crowd on such a crappy night. So thanks for being here. Julian was involved in the production of the book. H.K. Stewart, somewhere back there, gets full credit. It's a good-looking book. You'll have to see some at the end of the deal. But I want to thank y'all for being here. I have been a big fan of the Arkansas State Archives for a long time. To give you an idea of how long, here's my membership card. I'm number 1813. Does anybody else here have a lower number than that? I don't think so, because the numbers that they're giving out today, I think are like around 56,000, something like that. I've been a supporter of the History Commission, now the State Archives, for 40 years, 1 month, and 7 days. In fact, I'm older than a lot of stuff in their collection. But it's neat to be here, so thank you all for your support of the History Commission and the State Archives. I will call it the History Commission because I'm an old dog. As Julianne mentioned, my challenge tonight is to tell you a little bit about the books, why they came about, how did it happen, and what did I learn. And she mentioned Watson State Park. I'll talk a little bit about that, and even about one of the Z's coming up. But first, what are backstories? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. As she mentioned, I was tourism director for a long time, and I got some interesting assignments. One of them, about 30 years ago, I was sent to New York to a meeting of travel journalists from around the world. And I remember this lady from the German travel magazine came up. She saw my name tag. It said Joe David Rice, Arkansas. She says, Arkansas, Orbelfalbus. Not exactly what I wanted to hear, but Orbelfalbus is not a backstory. Then about 25 years ago, I was in London catching a cab from Heathrow to the city, and the cabbie, of course, asked, where are you from? And I said, the States. And he said, what state? Arkansas. And he says, Bill Clinton. Which is a little better than Orbelfalbus say, but still, Bill Clinton and Orbelfalbus are not backstories. In fact, these are some things that aren't backstories, like the flood of 27 and Hillary Clinton's run for the presidency and Douglas MacArthur and Sam Walton. These are not backstories. Backstories I have defined as the lesser known yet especially intriguing aspects of Arkansas's history. There's one person to blame. One of my favorite authors was a guy named Peter Mayle. He died about 2 years ago. He started out writing a copy for Shell Oil Company with an advertising agency back in London. And he liked writing so much, he wound up writing press releases, got rid of his advertising background. And then he was such a good writer, he became known for his fiction. He wrote a bunch of lighthearted English mysteries, and when I say lighthearted, they're basic English mysteries, no violence, no sex. But nevertheless, some of you all might enjoy them. And I have all of his books. And I was particularly intrigued when he released a nonfiction book called Provence A to Z. And at the time, I had not been to France. Still haven't been to southern France, but I have spent hours reading this book because it talks about the characters and curiosities and the neat things about Provence. I just flipped through this, day after day, hour after hour. And I said, well, somebody ought to do something similar. My wife, Tracy, back here said, well, Joe David, why don't you do it? So that's what I did. I spent a lot of months compiling research with Julianne's help and a lot of other folks, trying to figure out those lesser-known aspects of Arkansas, arranged like Peter Mayle's book, A to Z. I guess eventually I got about 300 topics, and HK and Rod Lorenzen and others said, that's too many topics for a book, so let's pare it down. And I eventually reduced the 300 or so topics to about 160. And several things I wanted to be in there, but they did not make the cut. For instance, Edgar Allan Poe, one of our favorite writers, right? I had read that he had spent some time in Ouachita County working for the Camden newspaper. I said, gosh, I've got to make sure to include that. But I was unable to substantiate that other than a couple references in the Ouachita County Historical Society. And I actually contacted the folks in Baltimore. And they said, well, Mr. Rice, we have a pretty good chronology of Poe's life from start to finish, and we don't think there was ever any time for him to have been in Arkansas back during those days. So Poe went by the wayside. Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy clan, I had heard some neat stories that he was involved in some nefarious activities transporting illicit liquor from Garland County to Chicago during Prohibition days. I said, oh man, that's got to be in there. But all I kept finding were this little bit of smoke, no fire. And I actually contacted David Nassau, who's written a book called Patriarch about the Kennedy's rise to power and all this. And I said, well, Professor Nassau, can you tell me if there's any evidence that Mr. Kennedy actually had ties to Hot Springs and transported moonshine in Mountain Valley tanker trucks from Hot Springs to Chicago? And those of you that don't know me don't realize I'm a chronic smartass. And when he said, well, Mr. Rice, I had complete access to the Kennedy archives and there was nothing in the official files, I almost said, well, duh, do you expect it to be in the official files? But no, I bit my tongue and said, well, thank you, sir. So that went by the wayside as well. But if any of y'all ever hear anything about Kennedy, let me know. One of my favorite authors is a guy named Aldo Leopold. You conservationists of the crowd will understand who he is. He wrote a classic book called the Sand County Almanac. And it's just one of the iconic pieces in American conservation literature. And I'd heard that he had some Arkansas ties, and I found out he actually owned 40 acres up where the current river flows from Missouri into Arkansas on the Arkansas side of the border. But that's all there is. I mean, I couldn't find any writing about his time in Arkansas, anything at all. So, you know, one sentence would have said he had some land in Arkansas, and I said, that's probably not going to entertain the crowd tonight. So he went by the wayside. Sir Henry Morton Stanley, he's the guy that spent a lot of time in Africa hunting for the elusive Dr. Livingston, and he had that immortal line, Dr. Livingston, I presume. Well, Henry Morton Stanley actually lived in South Arkansas, a few miles on the other side of Pine Bluff for a while in 1860, but just a matter of months. So not long enough for him to be considered an Arkansan, although there's at least one book that says he's one of us, and I disagree. Another one that didn't make the cut was pythons. I had seen an article about 10 years ago in USA Today that said that pythons had established a serpentine foothold, or whatever it would be, down in like Grand Lake and southeast Arkansas in Chico County, around Eudora and all. And I contacted the herpetologist who'd written the article, and he said, well, we did find some pythons in those swamps in southeast Arkansas that were released by irresponsible pet owners, and they are not yet at a breeding stage. But he said, climate's changing, watch out. So pythons fell by the wayside. So here are the places that we're going to start. 200 years ago, 1819, anybody know what happened 200 years ago? Arkansas Territory was established in, I think, March of 1819. And here's a map of the territory back in those days. And as you can see, it extended way to the west, including parts of present-day Oklahoma. And one of the first things that citizens of a territory are asked to do once it gets established is to send a representative to Congress to make sure the territorial interests are covered. Well, I think 4 or 5 guys filed to run, including Stephen Fuller Austin, who had moved to Arkansas just a short time before after an unsuccessful tenure as a businessman in Missouri. He filed at the very last minute. He lost by 58 votes. And my question to this august group is, if he had started his campaign at a more reasonable time and had been able to travel across the state by horseback and convinced 30 of those voters, and remember, women weren't voting back in those days, convinced 30 of those people to vote for him as opposed for his opponents, Austin would have gone to Congress as our representative. And if you've read anything about Stephen F. Austin, you realize he had a lot of ego, a lot of ambition, and he probably would have stuck around to become a U.S. senator or maybe even governor of Arkansas. But as it was, he lost and, of course, moved to Texas with his tail between his legs. But had he gone ahead as our territorial representative, what would have happened? One interesting theory is the U.S.-Mexican border today might be at Texarkana as opposed to El Paso. And you can see that that was Mexico back in those days. So you wouldn't have an Austin, Texas. You wouldn't have Stephen F. Austin College. You might not even have a Texas. Who knows? It's fun to think about, though, isn't it? When I started this research, I had no idea that Abraham Lincoln spent some time in Arkansas. You know, I'd read all the history stories about him traveling by flatboat down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where he had his foundation established for anti-slavery. But come to find out, on one of those trips downriver, he stopped at a town in Crittenden County, just north of, say, present-day West Memphis, very near where the Sultana blew up, right on the Mississippi River, at a town called Greenock. Greenock no longer exists. It got washed away by one of the floods. But he worked for a fellow named William Wapanaka Ferguson, and if you go over to East Arkansas, there's a Wapanaka National Wildlife Refuge, a Wapanaka Bio, etc. And Ferguson was a very prominent plantation owner, and Lincoln worked for him anywhere from a couple weeks to maybe a couple months, and perhaps even lived in the house with Ferguson at the time. But all this was brought to public notice well before Lincoln was assassinated, so this wasn't somebody trying to take advantage of Lincoln's notoriety later on. I had never heard of Congressman James N. Hinds. Anybody here heard of Hinds? He was a graduate from the North, moved to Arkansas after a stint in Minnesota. He was what we would call, in not very polite terms, a carpetbagger. But he was a pretty good guy. He had several legislative accomplishments during his short tenure as a member of Congress. He was the one responsible for getting Arkansas readmitted to the Union, the first of the Confederate States to come back into the United States. He introduced legislation which established the land-grant colleges, ultimately the University of Arkansas. He also sponsored legislation to sell the hot springs. Passed the House, but luckily the Senate had wiser heads and they killed that. Congressman Hinds was a Republican, a very strong supporter of U.S. Grant, and he was campaigning actively to make sure that the Reconstruction efforts continued, that the newly freed African Americans could own property, they could go to school, they could vote. And naturally, the Klan did not like this. They tried to warn him off. They put a coffin in front of his house in Little Rock. They put daggers through the top of it. They did everything they could to warn him off, but Hinds was hell-bent on making sure that all of our citizens had equal rights. And as a result, a member of the Klan shot him in the back in Monroe County on October 22nd, 1868. First sitting member of Congress to be assassinated, and yet in this whole state there's not a single monument or memorial or marker about Mr. Hinds. And I would encourage this group to maybe think about rectifying that. I was unfamiliar with George Edwin Taylor. He was born in Little Rock in 1857. His mother was one of 700 free blacks in the state at the time. His father was one of 50,000 slaves in the state. The Arkansas legislature in 1859 passed a bill called the Free Negro Expulsion Act that basically said if you were a free black in Arkansas, you better get out by the close of business in 1859 or you could be arrested and sold back into slavery. So young Hinds and his mom fled to St. Louis, and he wound up getting a very good education in Wisconsin. He was a skilled orator. He was a newspaperman. He was much in demand as a public speaker, talking about trying to elevate blacks by their bootstraps. In 1904, he was nominated for president as the National Negro Liberty Party's candidate. That election, of course, was won by Teddy Roosevelt, but George Edwin Taylor was the first African American to run for president. It was not, as I had assumed all along, Shirley Chisholm. As Julian mentioned, I have a background in conservation of parks. I'm going to talk about a national park that we almost had. You know, I'm not going to read these. We have a good number of national park units in Arkansas right now, but we nearly had another one called the QUACHITA National Park. Here is a spread from a brochure that the proponents published back in the 1920s. And you can see that it says the proposed park would be readily accessible to 40 million people, and this was in 1927. And if you remember, that's just when the automobile was really coming into vogue and paved roads were coming into vogue. Even in Arkansas, we finally had some paved roads. And the proponents said that all the national parks are way out west, and you can see Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Yosemite, they're all way the hell out west. And the argument was that there was a place in the Ouachita Mountains that was worthy of a national park, and it would be within a day's drive of 40 million people. And the congressional delegation of Arkansas got on this. The governor supported it, the American Cattlemen's Association supported it, the Isaac Walton League, the governors of the adjacent states all endorsed it. This is the proposed boundaries, and you can see this is Mena, and there's Glenwood. It's basically the headwaters of the Caddo and Little Missouri and Cossatot rivers, and you can see Hot Springs way over there. So it's just west of Hot Springs, about 45 minutes to an hour. It would have been big, about 163,000 acres, or 255 square miles, up to 35 miles long, 12 miles wide. And you can see that, to put it in perspective, it would be bigger than the combined acreage of the entire Arkansas State Park System of 2019 and the Buffalo National River. The one group that didn't fall into place was the National Park Service, an important group. But there was enough going on in Congress, the Park Service felt compelled to send ARNO B. CAMMERER'S to Arkansas. He was a deputy director, never been to Arkansas before. His train arrived in Mena late in the afternoon after a very severe thunderstorm moved through Polk County. He gets up the next morning to inspect 255 square miles. And after the thunderstorm, you all know what happens often in the Arkansas mountains, fog completely enveloped. So they get to the top of Eagle Peak there on the left. He can't see from here to HK. I mean, he's completely socked in by fog. So they say, well, let's go on down the Little Missouri River to see Little Missouri Falls. ARNO slips and falls into the creek, his glasses get washed away. So he is unable to complete his tour. So he goes back to DC, and nevertheless, he tells the people, I'm going to come back and see it when I've got my glasses. But he doesn't. And he tells his superiors, the National Park Service, ain't no way this needs to be a national park. Well, the congressional delegation in Arkansas would not take no for an answer. So the National Park Service was forced to send Roger Toll to Arkansas. Well, Roger was the superintendent at Yosemite, and later the superintendent at Rocky Mountain National Park. And Toll actually did more than go through the motions. He spent several days surveying the land. He wrote an 88-page report. I've read it word for word, had a lot of pictures. And he said that, you know, it's some pretty neat property, but it's really not up to the standards of the national park. Besides, there's some anti-recreational influences, particularly rattlesnakes and chiggers. And I wish I had been able to pull Toll aside and said, you're from Yosemite, right? Avalanches, sheer cliffs, mountain lions, grizzly bears, and you're talking about rattlesnakes and chiggers? Anyway, what happened was that the legislation passed the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, without difficulty. It went through the Senate without a single dissenting vote. And on his last day in office, Calvin Coolidge went to the Library of Congress to look over the final bill sent for his approval. He signed on most of them, but one he didn't sign, he pocket vetoed, was for the Ouachita National Park. And what happened was that evidently a Representative Colton from Utah was head of the House Committee on Public Lands. And if you remember that map up there showed all those national parks, several in Utah. Colton asked Coolidge to veto the bill because it would jeopardize the monopoly his parks had on national parks. And after Coolidge left, Herbert Hoover's president, depression comes across the country, and the Ouachita National Park falls from interest. So we could have had what would have been a spectacular national park in the middle of the Ouachitas, and just like 5 years later, the Congress passed the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and we could have had the Great Smoky Mountain National Park in western Arkansas, but it didn't happen. Okay, y'all probably know John and Wesley Huddleston, handsome dude there. He was a pig farmer down in Pike County, and he found some stones in his ground. He thought they were flakes of gold, and he sent them to the jeweler along with some other things that he found, and what he thought was gold was mica, but the other stones were diamonds, 2 diamonds. And the people at Stiff's Jewelry in Little Rock were sort of incredulous, and they forwarded them to New York and also to Washington, D.C., and both the Smithsonian and Tiffany's confirmed that these were real diamonds. They sent people down to Southwest Arkansas shortly thereafter. The Arkansas Diamond Development Corporation bought Huddleston's piece of land for $36,000 6 weeks after he found the diamonds, paying for it in $10 bills. And they set up a couple of operations. And just within a few weeks, there was like 30,000 people living in that part of Pike County. They called it New Kimberley, much like Kimberley, South Africa. But things were weird. Here's a quote from the Smithsonian Magazine a couple years ago saying, "A lot of funny business has been going on around the diamond field over the past half century." And that was an understatement, because among the 30,000 people that visited Pike County was a guy named Robert Oppenheimer. You may remember the name. He became head of De Beers. And they were finding diamonds left and right at the Diamond Development Corporation's property. I mean, thousands of them. And they needed a manager to to look after the operations. And the guy they picked was one of Oppenheimer's cronies. And the Department of Justice said that there was no question later on that this guy's objective was to sabotage the mine. So it went bankrupt, and they brought in another manager, and he was also an Oppenheimer crony. And the production fell to less than 1% of his previous production. Let's say Robert Ernst Oppenheimer. Anyway, Senator Caraway and Governor Atkins go to see Franklin Roosevelt in the early stages of World War II, saying, you know, we're in the middle of a war effort. We need some diamonds to develop armaments for the war effort. And we've got this great diamond mine down in Arkansas. And Roosevelt was fascinated. He says, well, we'll take care of that. But Oppenheimer's reach was so strong that he controlled the people on the War Production Board, and they were unable to honor Roosevelt's request. And then in 1947, Henry Ford tried to buy the diamond mine, again for the industrial diamonds, and Oppenheimer's people kept it closed. And nowadays, it's an Arkansas state park, and it'd be interesting to hear what Oppenheimer might say about that, because it's a far cry from what it could have been. But if you like state parks, it's pretty good that Oppenheimer's way held. Speaking of Senator Hattie Caraway, y'all probably know the story. Her husband, Thaddeus Caraway, died in December 1931, and the governor appointed her to fill out his term. And then in January, there was a special election, and everybody's sort of feeling sorry for her. And they said, well, she's only got 1 year left in this term. Let's let her win that. And so in 32, when the general election came around, or the primary, like 6 very prominent Democratic stalwarts decided to run. And everybody was thinking Hattie was going to sit this one out. And she did not file until the very last day. And everybody sort of felt sorry for her. In fact, if you've read David Pryor's book about the election, he said people didn't know whether to pity her or to laugh at her because she waited the last minute. But an interesting development happened. Huey Long, who sat next to her in the Senate, said, you know, Hattie, I'll be glad to help you out. And I'm not sure his motives were altogether pure, because he hated Joe T. Robinson, who was the senior senator from Arkansas at the time. And I think probably Huey Long was trying to make sure that he sort of gouged Robinson on this. Anyway, he agreed to help out. And he showed up in Arkansas, and the two of them barnstormed the state. They drove thousands of miles over 8 days, made 39 stops, and it's almost like a circus or something. And Huey Long had the ultimate political machine. And if you look at some of the literature back in those days, he announced his schedule. He said, we're going to, they misspelled Stuttgart, but Stuttgart, and they misspelled Harrisburg. He said Harrisonburg. They even misspelled Hattie Caraway's name. They put 2 R's in Caraway. But he was just the absolute epitome of a campaigner. And when the dust settled in the primary election, she won 60 of the 75 counties. In the general election, she won 90% of the vote and outpolled Franklin Roosevelt. And I love that quote when she said, basically, you know, it's not any good for a woman should be placed in a position and kept there while someone else is groomed for the job. And she was a woman ahead of her times. In fact, the next female didn't get elected to the Senate for 6,700 days, I think. She was a woman of distinction. We can be proud that Arkansas elected the first woman to the U.S. Senate. Julian mentioned Watson State Park. I'd never heard of Watson State Park until I started working on this book. Anybody here been to it? Good, because if you say you have, you're lying. It was built in 1937, and this is one of my favorite books, Arkansas, A Guide to the State. Some of y'all may have this. It was published in 1940 or 41, I think. And every state has one of these books as a product of the Roosevelt's New Deal program. And you can see the photograph there on the right. That's one of the few photos you'll ever see of Watson State Park. It was specifically developed for use by Negroes, because that was back in the Jim Crow days when black people weren't welcome at Petit. And speaking of that, here are the state parks circa 1940. And this is actually from the state park brochure. And you can see all the parks, and down there in the lower central it says Watson. You notice in parentheses it says Negro, because that's the way it was back then. Everything was just, segregated. It was not near the town of Watson, which is on the other side of Pine Bluff. It's named after a guy named John Watson, who was head of Arkansas A&M College. He donated the land. They actually had plans for about a 1,500-acre park, and the federal government backed out at the last minute, and Watson said, well, let's go ahead and do this. And the African-American school children in Arkansas raised $5,000 to match a $15,000 federal grant. You know, for a bunch of black kids to raise $5,000 in 1937 was one hell of an accomplishment. But they built dormitories and ball fields, and they had a swimming hole, and they had all this stuff. And here's the kind of press that was getting. That book I showed you has that first quote, but the one I really like is that bottom quote from the Atlanta Daily World. Arkansas had the nation's first all-colored park. You know, time and again we've been last in everything or the first in the wrong things. Well, here we were first in a good thing. But what happened was, I have no idea. But I think this was during World War II, and I think the state ran out of money. But in any event, the widow of Dr. Watson sued this Parks Commission saying that the commissioners have failed to meet their fiduciary responsibilities. They weren't developing the park as promised. And the court ruled in her favor, and the land was transferred back to the widow of Dr. Watson. And nowadays, this is about 7 miles. Is this side of Pine Bluff. It's all overgrown by pine trees. But it could have been a great park. And in the 1950s, all the southern states had African-American parks. In fact, a couple like Florida and Georgia had 2 or 3 parks specifically for African-Americans. The one exception, of course, was Arkansas. We did not have a single park for black folks back then. Okay, moving right along. I didn't realize that Arkansas had fielded a candidate for president in 1960. Did any of y'all? Ours is the one on the left. His name was James Elton Baker when he was born in Zack. Anybody here know where Zack is? Well, I'll show you in a minute. I know right where Zack is. He originally was named James Elton Baker, and his parents didn't even name him until he was a year old because he was such a sickly kid they thought they were going to die. He was going to die, and they didn't want to waste the name on him. But anyway, he grew up, and he spent $4.95 and bought a Montgomery Ward guitar. He learned to play guitar, and he was the best holder of his breath in Zack, Arkansas. You say, where is he going with this? Well, Zack is on a creek, like it's near the Buffalo River, and I'll show you where Zack is. Right there is where Zack is. This orangish serpentine thing is Highway 65, going from up toward Harrison down to Marshall. You can see the town of Gilbert. If you look close, you can see a little blue squiggle up there. That's the Buffalo River. Well, Zack was between Gilbert and Marshall, but you couldn't get there by road. But there's a railroad that connected through there. The Missouri and North Arkansas, MNA, may never arrive. Anyway, there's a great creek there, and James Elton Baker learned to hold his breath longer than anybody else. They're swimming underwater. And this came in handy later because he became the world's best yodeler. He was the first country singer to be awarded a gold record. He sang in the White House for President Franklin Roosevelt. He went to different USO troops and showed his skill. Anyway, he decided that he had some political potential based on what he'd seen Jimmy Davis do down in Louisiana, parlayed his musical expertise to a career as a politician. So in January of 1960, Elton Britt, who had to change his name because his agent said James Elton Baker wasn't hillbilly enough, so he became Elton Britt, announced that he was running for president in New Hampshire. And he had a platform of education, farm aid, and foreign policy. But he didn't elaborate. 17 days later, officials from that other candidate showed up, and they said, we think that Mr. Britt's qualifications don't meet the standards, and why don't you double check? And come to find out, a lot of the signatures on his petition were either dead people or fraudulent. So he got kicked off. One of my many flaws is I collect political buttons of Arkansas's favorite sons and daughter. And you can see I've even got an Eldridge Cleaver and Orville Faubus and Win Rockefeller, but I've yet to find an Elton Britt for president button. If anybody has one, let me know, because I would like to add that to my collection. This research also led to a rekindling of a traumatic experience. When I got out of college, I moved to Hot Springs. And when you live in Hot Springs, everybody wants to come see you. And some of my college roommates wanted to come down, and we went to the races, and they said, let's go to the IQ Zoo. I had never been to the IQ Zoo. And they talked me into playing tic-tac-toe against a chicken. Naturally, I lost. The worst 25 cents I ever spent. But come to find out, the IQ Zoo chicken was a pretty damn good tic-tac-toe player. The Brelands, who owned the IQ Zoo, owned Animal Behavior Enterprises. They're the ones that trained all the animals for SeaWorld and Disney and Marlin Perkins. I mean, they were really, really good. And they trained these chickens to play tic-tac-toe, and B.F. Skinner himself, who was their mentor, did not beat the damn chicken. He tried and failed, so, you know, I can live with that. What people don't realize is that the IQ Zoo was more than a tourist haunt. They had contracts with every branch of the U.S. military. They trained dolphins to trail boats and to help find downed airmen. They trained crows to spot snipers. They trained pigeons. They even built replicas of Eastern European villages on their farm outside Hot Springs. And they trained pigeons with a camera on their breast to fly up to a window and press against the glass and take pictures of the occupants. And they did all this neat kind of stuff, and you never hear about that. But and then we don't even know what they were doing for the CIA. I actually sent a letter to the CIA asking for details, and I think my phone was tapped shortly after. Okay, I'm a big fan of the Buffalo River. And in fact, I used to own a canoe outfitting business on the Buffalo. And you know, we all are familiar with the Buffalo and its story. But do you realize that three of the most controversial politicians in America's 20th century regime were involved? Orville Faubus, of course, the segregationist governor. William Douglas, the Libertarian Supreme Court justice, is the one who floated the river and was interviewed, I think, in Life or Sports Illustrated, and said, you know, this is a treasure, we got to take it. And then Richard Nixon. You know, Nixon has gotten a bad rep, but when you look at his record as an environmental president, nobody even comes close. He signed the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, time and again, the Wilderness Act. He also signed the bill that made the Buffalo become a national river. So, as Julian said, I was your tourism director for about 30 years. You know, I was sort of cocky at the end of that, thinking, gosh, I know everything. But this was a great exercise in humility because I realized there's so much I didn't know. And I hope I've shared some of this with you today. The end result is these two books, and I do have a few copies for sale. I'll even autograph them. And I must admit that my mother said, Joe David, you know, it's almost Christmas. Why don't you tell them this would be great Christmas gifts? And this is my mother speaking, not me. So anyway, I got time for questions, I think. Do we have time? If there are any easy questions, I usually try to plan a few easy ones, but I failed to this time, so I'm going to just see how it goes.
Have you ever been to Zach?
Sir?
Have you ever been to Zach?
I've been to Zach several times. The road to Zach, it's like a title for a book, doesn't it? It goes down the old railroad right-of-way, and there's a neat rental cabin complex off the right across a really spectacular bridge and all. So I can recommend a trip to Zach, but don't plan on spending money in Zach. Ain't no place to spend money. Other questions? Yes?
Whatever happened to Dog Patch?
Dog Patch. That was an interesting project up on Highway 7. Y'all may have been up to Marble Falls. It's just north of Jasper, just across the Buffalo River up there. Was it Jess Odom that built that, I think?
No, he just bought it and then sucked water out of it.
Anyway, whoever built it put in Swiss chalets and trams and ski slopes. They did everything, but they didn't have any snow. So that's why it went kaput. Actually, I'm thinking about Marble Falls. But Dog Patch, I think what happened to Dog Patch is that the generation of people that would go to Dog Patch, they don't know what Dog Patch is. Like, you know, our children, grandchildren know about Disneyland, and they know about all that stuff, but Dog Patch, Outcap just is irrelevant today. So anyway, it's still there. You can sneak in and go through the old buildings and all. You might get arrested, but it's an abandoned theme park.
I did that. I'm always a fan of
Okay.
I'm from California.
Next question. Yes?
Without giving anything away from the book, you got any good sports stories?
Good sports stories, yeah. We all know that, can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Barry Bryant is from, I often say Fordyce, but actually from Monroe County, down outside Fordyce. And you know, he went off and played football at Alabama, did very good, and then he was a coach in Kentucky for a while, and A&M. But before those schools, he was a coach, I think at Vanderbilt, an assistant coach. And the head football coach at the University of Arkansas got fired, and Barry Bryant wanted that job so bad that he actually came and talked to the governor twice, and the governor said, the job's yours. And he was driving back to Tennessee to tell his wife to move to Fayetteville, On December 7, 1941, he heard that the Japs had attacked Pearl Harbor, and he became a sailor in the Razorback. It's not a bad sports story.
Not a bad story.
Yes?
Did somebody say that you wrote the Floater's Guide or the newest guide to Arkansas?
Yeah, we published the Floater's Guide about 35 years ago. That was one of my first jobs.
Well, that was the Parks Commission?
The state parks, yes.
Is that the loose leaf thing?
Yeah.
It's been cut off? Is it still available?
No, I've got one, I'll sell you. I'm going to tell you a quick story about the Buffalo River. My first year in the business, do we have time for one quick story?
Sure.
I was up there, and it was May, it was a perfect spring day, about 75 degrees, big white clouds against the deep blue sky, and a perfect day to float. And this couple from Louisiana comes in, they tell me they want to go paddling. So they sign the forms, their credit card clears, and say, sure. So I put the canoe on top of the Suburban, and our place was on Highway 65, just north of Marshall, one place called Silver Hill. And so we're going up and across the bridge there on 65, and I said, we're going to float right over this bridge in a couple hours, I'll pick up and go. So we're going up, and we're going to a place called Woolham, which is right where Richmond Creek flows into Buffalo. Beautiful spot, big gravel bar. In fact, there's so much water going across the shoals you could hardly talk. I mean, it's perfect conditions. So I put the canoe on the gravel bar, and I tie their ice chest in. I give them the paddles, their life jackets. The guy takes his place in the stern. The woman's getting ready to step into the bow. Just as I'm ready to shove into the water, the guy does one of these and says, "Which way do we go?" Lucky for them, we were having a special downstream. I pointed downstream. Anyway, I picked them up about 5 hours later. Like 95% of our customers, they had a grand time. They were ready to buy a piece of paradise. Now you're probably saying, well, Joe, what about the other 5%? Well, after a careful analysis, we determined that this couple's having trouble in their relationships, and I thought a float trip would be a great way to patch things up. Any other questions?
Is there any backstories to London Abner? Surprised you didn't mention them.
London Abner over at Pine Ridge. If you want to know the truth, I had nothing else, and I didn't do London Abner.
Good answer.
But there's a lot more backstories. I've been told others, like there's a Massey, a scientist, that I should have done something. And that Florence Price, the African American composer, you know, I didn't even know about her until after the book was published. So I've got
So you're
another, yeah, except like the first one is A through L, the next one is M through Z, and I don't know what to do with the third one. So
Okay.
Everything left.
everything left. Any other questions? Yes.
What was the story about the audience or voiceover or
Laugh track?
Laugh track. That's what it is.
Well, Tracy back here will tell you that when we're watching TV and once laugh tracks going, God, that damn laugh track just annoys the hell out of me. Right? Do y'all get annoyed by laugh tracks? I'm pretty peculiar in a lot of ways, so we won't go with that. But laugh tracks just get on my every last nerve. And come to find out, Bob Burns, who's about my least favorite Arkansan, is one reason we got laugh tracks. He was on some of the radio shows a long time ago. He would tell these off-color stories about Arkansas, you know, Bill Leadless and doing that kind of stuff. Of course, the audience howled. And they just picked up the technology of recording all this stuff, and some bright guy says, well, let's say Bob Burns' over-enthusiastic response and use it somewhere else. And so these jokes that were told at Arkansas Expense generated this huge outpouring of laughter, and the guy did the laugh box and put that stuff in there. So Bob Burns is the reason we have laugh tracks, sort of. It was sort of a specious connection. I got my D at Burns. Any other questions? Y'all been a great audience, and I really appreciate you coming out on such a crappy night. And I do have some books back here from Buddy wants it, and I want to thank the Arkansas State Archives for having me here, for feeding us all, and I had a good supper. Thank you for that. And they're doing really good work. And if you have a chance, make sure that your legislature knows that the Arkansas State Archives, or for me, the History Commission, is a vital part of Arkansas government. And yours, you have so many resources in the archives. It's just amazing what they have there. If you haven't been over there, They will help you with your genealogical research. They'll help you out with Watson State Park or Zach or whatever. Thank you a lot.